All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm Emily Fagan, and I'm the marketing coordinator for the BC Humanists Association. I'm just going to say a few quick words of introduction before tonight's panel. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I live and work on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples, whose historic relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be on the shared territory, although I was not invited to do so. So there's a quick couple of housekeeping notes I want to hit at the beginning. So given the turnout tonight, I've muted everyone on Zoom to prevent any interruptions. However, if you have a question at any point for our panelists, there's a little chat box at the bottom, so you can just type it out and I will ask the panelists on your behalf. We're also streaming tonight's talk on Facebook, and we'll release a video of it on YouTube next week, and our podcast will also have it next week. So tonight's event is titled Conversion Therapy in Canada, a panel with Dr. Kristopher Wells and Matt Ashcroft. Last week, a nationwide ban on conversion therapy faced major setbacks. By prorogating Parliament, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has left a pioneering bill on this issue dead in the water. The bill, C8, would have made it illegal to subject a minor to conversion therapy, to remove a minor from Canada to undergo conversion therapy abroad, to cause a person to undergo conversion therapy against their will, to profit from providing conversion therapy, or to advertise the practice. If we don't act soon, it could be months, even years, before a similar bill is brought forward to address these issues. If you haven't already, please sign the petition on our website calling on MPs to reintroduce and pass a nationwide conversion therapy ban, and please call your MPs. Our next special virtual event, a talk on the House of Prayers report, released by us, is coming out on September 24th. Keep an eye on our newsletter and social media for information on how to RSVP coming soon. From here, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. So starting with Matt, would you like to introduce yourselves and talk briefly about your background and how you first got involved in your advocacy work on LGBTQ rights?
Thank you, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. So my name is Matt Ashcroft. I go by he/him pronouns. I'm currently a settler. Mississauga is in the New Credit River, Toronto. So I am a conversion therapy survivor that had experienced my conversion therapy in a program in the United States called Journey into Manhood, or People Can Change. It was actually 5 years ago, like right now, that I left conversion therapy. So I looked at my memories on my Facebook and I was like, wow, this is when I left. This is when I left the US and decided that I wanted to live my life free, and I never looked back. I went to conversion therapy again 5 years ago. I've experienced a lot of bullying and hate. I've seen somebody's rape story reenacted in front of my eyes. I saw somebody that was wanting to transition into a woman crawl underneath a blanket rolled up by 8 other men to crawl underneath the blanket, simulating a birth to say that you're a man. And I just knew that these practices were hateful and hurting people, and it hurt me. I was assaulted. I was sexually assaulted. I was stalked, which I'm now freely talking about it in public, to the point where I didn't feel safe to be in my hometown. So I made some really foolish decisions because I didn't really have a lot of people to talk to, which ended up with a lot of depression for 5 years ago. I didn't really see myself having a future, and with broken relationships after broken relationships, I went and did my first CBC interview when the movie Boy Erased came out, and then shortly after, my my former conversion therapist came out publicly, which went viral. And I decided that the only way that I'm going to make any changes with somebody that has done me personal harm is if I speak out about my experiences and empower other people to speak out as well. That's what I want to do, and that's what I want to continue to do. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. My name's Dr. Kristopher Wells. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm speaking to you from Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory. And it's a real privilege and honor to speak alongside Matt and to be able to help support other survivors to find justice and peace, and to ensure that conversion therapy is no longer practiced in Canada. That's the goal that everyone is striving towards. By way of my background, I'm an associate professor at MacEwan University in the Department of Child and Youth Care, and I hold the Canada Research Chair for the Public Understanding of Sexual and Gender Minority Youth, and I'm the editor with the International Journal of LGBTQ Youth. And all of my academic work is informed from my experiences working alongside youth in the community. I started my career as a classroom teacher back in the 90s in Alberta, when there were no human rights protections on the grounds of sexual orientation. So you couldn't be out as a teacher. And I really found I couldn't be the kind of role model or teacher that I wanted to be for LGBTQ youth. And I started working with a local LGBTQ youth group. And I remember the first night I walked into the room, they asked me two questions. Who are you and what do you do? And I said, my name is Chris and I'm a teacher. The next thing they said was do something to make things better for us. And that's what led me back to graduate school. And the path that I'm on is always taking research back into communities to drive the social change that we need, and to really amplify the voices of young people to be able to find their truth, speak their truth to those who are in positions of power, and also to help young people recognize the power that they do have when they do speak out and they are supported, to help them move from feeling that they have to simply try to survive in their schools or their families or their communities to a place where they can be supported to thrive and be themselves fully and authentically. So this work around conversion therapy is an issue that's very important. It doesn't just impact youth, although we see many laws that are only focused on youth. This is an issue that affects many people within the LGBTQ community. In fact, I once heard from a person who said, I don't know an LGBTQ person alive today that hasn't been impacted by some form of conversion therapy, because the whole goal of conversion therapy starts from a premise of an anti-LGBTQ ideology, where it's not okay, it's sinful or immoral to simply be an LGBTQ person. So, thank you for hosting this very important topic. And we hope that after this talk today, people will feel further supported and inspired to go out and contact whether it's their local city councillor, their provincial members of their legislative assemblies, or their members of parliament, because we really believe that action needs to be taken against conversion therapy at all levels of government, and that can start by having conversations in our communities.
Yeah, so kind of going off of that, a lot of people might not know what conversion therapy looks like in Canada today, or even that it exists. So would you be able to speak to like what it looks like in Canada today and what the risks are associated with the continued lack of a federal ban on this practice?
Sure, who do you want
to go, Chris?
Okay, I'll give the brief overview, and Matt will jump in, of course. The basic definition of conversion therapy is simply any attempt to fix, repair, suppress, or change a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or their attractions. So treatments have ranged from the past historically to things like electroshock therapy, to chemical castration, to forced hysterectomies, to even things like lobotomy. Alan Turing is perhaps one of the most famous examples of someone who is subjected to a form of conversion therapy and ended up taking his own life. And we don't know the gifts to humanity that Turing could have continued to contribute if he were still alive. A lot of conversion therapy, unfortunately, operates within faith-based and some cultural communities. And I think people are quite surprised to know that conversion therapy is not just a thing of the past, but it's something that's still happening today, although it's largely underground, which makes it harder to detect. It goes by many different names now. There are not many groups that openly advertise or say that they practice conversion therapy, but you know, it's still a reality, and a very damaging reality for so many individuals.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. To give you a little context from my experience, with what I dealt with, there would be software which would be called Covenant Eyes, that people would look at your history of porn or anything like that, and they would just watch and monitor you, so that way that you don't like freely express your sexuality the way that you want to. I do know for a fact that Zoom calls and internet and actually, if you don't mind, I'm gonna read you an email, just like a title of an email that I got today from my old conversion therapy camp, just to give you a little bit of context, if that's okay. So, preface: my husband is attracted to men. Now what? Brothers Road webinar, Sunday, August 30th. So it's essentially a webinar that they host online, that they pay money for, allegedly. They have support groups for people that change their unwanted same-sex attractions. And so they would use the internet or any tools to A, sell people a lie, and B, go after vulnerable people, whether it's people in marriages, where there's young people. Most of my experiences is people that have been married to a woman and that cheated on their wives, and they're in a religious family and they don't know what to do, and so they succumb to conversion therapy. So have promotions like this that get sent out to emails, and men that identify as same-sex attracted, which are gay, but identify as same-sex attracted, would go to these events because they want to have some sort of help with their sexuality, which is kind of an odd way to put it, but that's exactly what they do.
And as Matt was saying, you know, conversion therapy can be big business. You know, we even have cases here in Canada where people have paid upwards of $12,000 for some of these programs. The conversion therapy movement really started to take off in the 1980s and 90s with a group called Exodus and what's known as the ex-gay movement. People who often claim that they've been cured of quote unquote homosexuality and found freedom from homosexuality through Jesus Christ. And so Exodus at one time had over 250 ministries operating in 17 countries. It closed its operations in North America in 2013 when famously its then president came out and denounced conversion therapy as a fraud and as a deceptive practice that simply doesn't work. And to date, 9 former ex-gay leaders have denounced conversion therapy as ineffective and harmful. So it's really important for people to know that there is no research or scientific evidence that supports the efficacy of conversion therapy. It's considered to be an unscientific, fraudulent, dangerous, and deceptive practice that is very harmful. As Matt already talked about, it can lead to depression, to self-harming behaviors, to suicide ideation, and even cases where people end up taking their own lives because of the experiences that they've had in these conversion therapy programs. They can be delivered as a kind of a 12-step program, or can be cases of young people in particular have been subjected to exorcisms to drive out the gay demons and the satanic forces. And so this isn't just happening, you know, someplace else in the world. It's happening, you know, here in many of our communities.
One of my friends that actually lived in Belleville, one of the things that I saw is he had issues with his mom, and I'm just discovering this too. So they would attribute being gay as an overprotective mother and an absent father. So his mother, there was an issue with his mother. I can't really remember, so I'm not going to speak on that. But what I can speak on is his mother, his mother was dead to him or something. They said a funeral to his mother, so they were like, he was doing a eulogy to his mother, just to say that you're dead to me for what you have done to me. And this is just a tangible example that I have experienced. But there's also many, like Chris was saying, there's many different cases of people that either go into church basements, where you Google search how to cure unwanted same-sex attraction via Google search. You'll be able to find something in your local area. So it's exponential on what conversion therapy looks like, and how it's dealt with from place to place. But it could even be as simple as being on a Zoom call. It's here, it's happening, and it needs to stop.
And as Matt was saying, you know, how they try to convince people that conversion therapy is an actual therapy, which it's not a therapy at all. That's why we often put conversion therapy in quotes, because it operates on these very stereotypical false premises that, you know, some come from these Freudian theories that, you know, an absent father, an overbearing mother causes a person to be gay. So they put you through these kind of reparenting strategies that, you know, Matt described, or, you know, acting out your unresolved anger towards your parents, or they do gender coaching, you know, feeling like if you can get rid of these what are deemed feminine mannerisms in particularly gay male, or these masculine traits in you know, lesbian women, from the way that you sit, from the clothes that you dress, the way that you talk, the way that you walk. It's about policing your body into these so-called quote unquote heterosexual norms. But they also operate under this premise that you're LGBT because you were sexually abused as a child, and try to take you through these regression therapies to get back to the root, what they see as the trauma of the brokenness that has caused you to choose this quote unquote lifestyle or this path of deviance or sin. So many of this, the theories that they purport can sound real, but we know that there's no science or research that actually supports any of the quote unquote truth behind those stereotypical beliefs that this is what causes someone to be gay or to have these unwanted quote unquote same-sex attractions is often the language that they use. So a big part of, I think, of this work and what we've seen from many of the hearings that have been held around the various forms of legislation that have been enacted to prohibit conversion therapy across Canada is we have to do a lot of debunking. We have to make sure that people actually know the facts and the science. And a lot of it is just steeped in this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and these same old tired stereotypes about LGBTQ people that, you know, you've suffered abuse, or you're, you know,
don't like sports.
Yeah, you don't like sports, or you had a bad experience in sports or bullying, or that you're somehow a predator, right? Or somebody preyed upon you to cause this kind of unresolved trauma.
So one common argument from religious groups is an overly broad ban could potentially criminalize what they describe as simple conversations between clergy and individuals who are exploring their identity. How do we or should we reconcile religious freedom with the protection of LGBTQ youth?
So I see a therapist now. Okay. So I see a therapist now, and um, if I were to say, if I were to come out to my therapist, um, the one of the common arguments that I hear is, I can't counsel you because that is my faith. As soon as you do that, what it does is it holds on to what my personal beliefs are, and it infringes that on you. So I would feel that an appropriate response was, okay, so I'm gay. What do I do? When did you start feeling like you had these feelings? That would be an appropriate response to have the exploration of what a person should decide. A counselor never decides anything for you. You ultimately decide it for yourself.
Yeah, and Matt's really, done a great job of addressing that that question that we hear a lot for virtually every hearing or every conversion therapy prohibition law that's been passed. That argument has come up, and we have to. These laws don't prevent parents from talking to their children. They don't prevent faith leaders from talking to members of their congregation. What they stop are these kind of organized, deliberate programs or attempts to actively try to fix or change somebody. So, as Matt said, exploration is a huge part of identity development. It's an important part of counseling and support. So long as that that support is non-judgmental, doesn't start with a predetermined outcome that being an LGBTQ person is not acceptable, then there's no problem at all, right? In fact, we know that those are critical, important ways that people find support, is through open, non-judgmental, affirming conversation.
Yeah.
So in Canada, we also have the Charter, right, which is very important. And these laws do nothing to take away a person's freedom of religion or freedom of expression in this country. But in Canada, we do place limitations on those rights and freedoms. We've had clear cases go all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. So your freedom of religion is important, but it does not also give you the freedom to discriminate and cause harm to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Going off of that, so same-sex marriage has been legal for 15 years in Canada. However, the fight for equality is far from over. What would you say are the biggest barriers to social and legal equality for LGBTQ plus people in Canada?
Ooh,
it's a big question.
That was very big, sorry.
Yeah. I'm happy to start and
yeah, go ahead
and jump in. I think we often say that many people feel that we have achieved legal equality for LGBTQ people in Canada, which is not true. Just look at HIV disclosure and criminalization. Look at the gay blood ban that's still in place. We know there are many other kinds of examples. But to achieve social equality is something different, right? That's about hearts and minds of people in the community. And so a big part of changing social attitudes is education, right? We often say, as an educator, I'm biased as a teacher, but it's education, education, education. And we need to start early. We need to start these conversations in the school, at home, out in the community. We need to have them early and often. For example, where I'm located in Alberta, there's not one mention of LGBTQ issues in the entire K-12 provincial curriculum. So what does that tell people, right? It tells LGBTQ youth in particular that their identities don't matter. They don't have value. They're invisible. They've been erased from their textbooks. We're having these conversations right now all over society about racism and about privilege and about sexism. And so much of that ignorance is based in a lack of education, a lack of understanding, a lack of of empathy. So, if I were to say to do one thing, it would be about educating people in schools, educating parents, educating people out in society about LGBTQ realities. And a big part of that education process is visibility.
Yeah, I would add on to that and just saying, like, in even in spaces that I'm in, downtown Toronto, there's like not a lot of talk about things that it's like almost appreciative of the freedoms that you have, but there's like freedoms are worth, if you really want your freedoms, then it's worth fighting for. And so knowing, seeing, and or understanding that not just conversion therapy, but like Rainbow Railroad, HIV and AIDS, like any organization that is queer related, queer trans and other related, is important to us, because we are already a struggling, marginalized community. And so how do we come together in issues that are most important to us? And so Chris is right. We have to have those conversations. They're unavoidable, and we just need to have people like us to like continuously fight for things that we care about.
And as Matt said, by mentioning organizations like Rainbow Railroad, for those who don't know, that support LGBTQ refugees and support the process to be able to come from Canada. There's still 70 plus countries in the world where being LGBTQ is a crime, and more than 6 where it's punishable by death. So we recognize the tremendous privilege that we have here in Canada, and we've come a long way. Yes, we still have more work to do, but we also have an obligation to support others around the world who don't have those same freedoms and privileges. But it also speaks to the point of how important it is to support with funding and otherwise LGBTQ organizations in our community, who are the ones that are doing this kind of frontline work as well. So there's not enough funding. Many of those organizations go out of business because of the lack of funding and the lack of government support. Things like HIV have traditionally been early organizations started out of crisis in the LGBT community, and were funded by LGBTQ community members. In fact, here in Edmonton, it was the local Imperial Sovereign Court of the Wild Rose, the Drag Queen and King Court, that did some of the earliest fundraising by hosting shows and passing the hat to support this important work.
Have either of you experienced backlash or protesters of your work and advocacy?
That's a good question. I experienced a lot of backlash. I experienced a lot of hate online. I kind of gotten used to it, which is a little odd, but somebody on one of my CBC interviews, somebody said you should crank up the volume on the electric shock or whatever, and I'm just like, no, that's okay. Like, I'm good with that. Like, that's another thing. Just quick side note, like for any people that been through conversion therapy and that are want to be activists or advocates, one of the things that I would like to teach somebody else is like to make sure that we have a really good support network of people around you, because if you don't, you're going to run into a lot of people. Oh, I did run into Leslyn Lewis. That was a funny story. So, so I ran into Leslyn Lewis on the train after Ottawa. I didn't tell you the story, Chris, but after Ottawa, and she had, it was a Power in Politics interview. And she was playing she was rebuttaling against Bill C-8, our bill. And so I was watching on the train, and the person that I was with was right beside me. He was like, hey, that's her right there. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I went and retweeted her on Twitter. I was like, I'm on the train. We can actually have a conversation about this instead of you spreading misinformation on this train. She didn't say a thing to me, and then she just went into the Durham region where she lives. So that's it. The end.
Just to echo Matt's point, certainly we know the rhetoric on social media heats up, and you know, you can get targeted by many anonymous sources, or even swarmed by, you know, groups of individuals. You know, that's the unfortunate, sad reality. Often, the more you speak out and the more visible you become on these issues, the more of a target you are. And many of these movements need to target individuals because they need a focus for their followers to raise money, to show that there's an enemy, you know, in the shape of a person or a group of people. But, you know, this is the reality queer people have faced, you know, throughout time. And we face this every day, is this notion of we're always vigilant. We're vigilant for our own safety wherever we go. You know, we've learned to walk into spaces and to read a room quickly. Is this a safe space or not a safe space? And unfortunately, issues like conversion therapy tend to bring out people with strong anti-LGBTQ ideologies, and many of them can be relentless in their attacks, in their defamation, in the kinds of messages that they share online. And again, we just hope that people can be critical consumers of information and be able to tell the truth from the fiction, and look at the sources for the people who are launching these kinds of attacks. But, you know, this is a reality that keeps many people from speaking out, that simply don't want to engage or speak out on behalf of our LGBT community members, because they don't want to be targeted. You know, the doxing that happens online, or people who try to, you know, target your employer. I know myself, I have tremendous privilege. I'm in a university, I'm a tenured professor, so it's very difficult to get me fired, although they try all of the time. In fact, I often tell my senior university administrators that the more complaints that you get about me, the better job I'm doing, because the status quo does not change on its own, and it will make people uncomfortable. But, you know, I recognize not everyone has that privilege as well. But there are many times I've had to go to the police service and have to have them investigate threats against myself or against others who've spoken up, and to ensure for our safety. You know, there are very little things that you learn to do. It's very rare that I'll give an interview in my office, for example, because people can find out where I am then, and it's very easy to walk into a university as a public space, right? But this is just that reality of being a queer person, is we're constantly aware of our safety.
Yeah, like when I first started doing interviews, like I was always watching over my shoulder, because I felt like something was happening to me. And the more interviews that I did, the more that the reality is that I'm going to stand strong in what I say, because the long-term goal is to have nobody to go through something that I went through. And as long as you keep that in perspective, regardless of what other people are going to do to you, the goal remains the same. And it's about protecting people, it's about lives being saved, and it's about preventing things from what happened to me. And that's what I care about. I care less about what happens to me, because I know that there are survivors out there that have been in way worse situations than what I have, and they are doing their best, and they're doing okay, and they're being strong and fierce advocates that are in Canada. Like, for example, one of our colleagues, Peter Guidage, has like been doing this for 20 plus years, and I'm thankful and grateful for the work that Peter has done. And if it wasn't for people that paved the way for advocates like us, like it starts with something, and it starts with a dream and a goal and a vision. And Peter Guidage is like the one who paved that way for all. And he also was the first person to suggest that the conversion therapy ban should not be restricted to only minors. It should be to adults as well, because I'm not going to speak for Peter's story, but Peter did his conversion therapy as an adult as well, around the same age. And so it's really, so we just need people like that to really push in the direction where we want is equitable change. So.
In speaking about conversion therapy bans, can you talk about your experiences with Bill C8 and any thoughts you have on like the strengths and weaknesses of this bill?
Specifically, I think it should be changed. Sorry, I got to bring it up. I did not expect that. Give me a second.
Yeah, well, Matt's bringing up those points. So with Bill C8, we heard with the proroguement of Parliament that the bill effectively dies on the order paper unless the full consent of Parliament will allow it to come back, which is probably not likely. But the government mandate letters don't change. So the government still has made a commitment to prohibit conversion therapy in Canada and should be held accountable to deliver what's in the mandate letter of Minister, not only Lametti, but Minister Chagger as well. So I would fully expect that the federal government will bring back a new conversion therapy bill. Hopefully they will have the opportunity to address the critiques of the current legislation. You know, for example, one very obvious glaring absence is the lack of inclusion of gender identity, which is a protected ground in the Canadian Human Rights Act and every provincial and territorial human rights legislation to ensure that there's full and adequate protection for all trans and non-binary Canadians. Matt already mentioned that a real comprehensive ban must include all ages. In fact, some of the primary targets for conversion therapy are young adults who are very susceptible to conversion therapy. So the legislation gets some things right and some things that certainly need to be improved. So this is a great opportunity for the federal government to listen to the LGBT community and bring forward the most comprehensive legislation possible. In fact, Canada has an opportunity to bring in the strongest conversion therapy legislation in the world. And I think given the privilege that we have, we should be using our privilege and our platform to set that example to other countries to be able to follow. And Canada has done that in the past. When Canada created its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that was a beacon of light seen around the world. And in fact, when South Africa came out of apartheid, they looked to Canada and our charter as an example of how they wanted to build their constitution and their nation. So there are definitely, not only again at the federal level, but we also need to ensure that there is conversion therapy at the provincial level and the municipal level, because each level of government has different powers, which is also, you know, we saw the failed legislation on conversion therapy that was introduced in British Columbia, and it was very disappointing to see the NDP not support that legislation. And I would hope that new legislation will be introduced, because a federal legislation is not going to address all of the issues in Canada when it comes to conversion therapy. So the most comprehensive approach is to have legislation at each level. In fact, the legislation passed in Calgary in their bylaw is arguably the most amongst the most comprehensive legislation in the world, because it targets all people and all groups when it prohibits conversion therapy.
Yeah, to like bounce back on just like the active role in BC. Like BC was tough because like the Green Party was the one that introduced the bill, and allegedly there was no suggestions from the NDP party. So there was days that we spent on Twitter that we were fighting with some people that we were either affiliated with or with the party. And we're not doing this to be bad guys. We're just wanting to bring equitable change, and you know what to do. You know what is right, and all we want is to have our freedoms intact. So, or sorry, all we want is our freedoms, because at the end of the day, people are dying from this and it's not safe. I know from firsthand experience. I know the the trauma that I've experienced. I went through years of therapy. I'm trying to do okay. There's some days that I get extremely depressed and think about some really horrible, awful things that had happened to me, and I just don't want that for anybody else, because it's there. It's there. So thank you.
You know, in terms of critiques too, there's a lot of notion of consent, and that somehow people can consent to conversion therapy of adults, but you can't consent to something that's known to be fraudulent, unscientific, and harmful. In fact, we place limits on adult quote unquote consensual behavior in this country all the time. We need to look no further than, for example, than seatbelt laws. You know, many people may feel that they're willing to accept the risk of driving without a seatbelt, or that it infringes upon their freedoms, but we know that that's not in the public interest to allow that. As well, you can't go into a doctor and request a particular medical procedure, right? We'll only be performing procedures that are scientifically valid, that are appropriate for the condition. There are all kinds of various situations. So I think that's a bit of a misnomer of an argument that's often heard, that somehow we should only prohibit forced conversion therapy, right? And by default, what that presumes is that there are other forms of conversion therapy that are somehow acceptable, and they're not. There's no form of conversion therapy that is acceptable.
Thank you for that.
So what do you feel needs to be done beyond legislation? For example, how do we create a more inclusive culture?
Again, these big issue questions. I think it comes back to, again, what an absence that exists in Bill C-8 is one of the big absences there, as it's currently written, is the lack of support for survivors. Survivors are the ones who should be front and center in terms of legislation, in terms of support, and education as well. So, it would be great to see a government fund to support counseling for survivors should they want to, engage in that, to help overcome some of the damage and the post-traumatic stress and all of the issues that Matt spoke about earlier, because counseling can be enormously expensive and beyond the reach of many individuals. So I think, that's important, but, it comes back to, again, encouraging survivors to find the support they need, and as they're interested and able, supported to speak out about their experiences.
One of the things that, it's challenging, because when people get out of their families, because usually families are the ones that have pressured people to go into conversion therapy. Once they don't have their family, and once they don't have their support network, where do they go? I don't know. It could be a lot of things. I have heard stories where people do drug use, they're homeless. There's a bunch of different factors that happen when people leave when they leave conversion therapy. One of the things that I've experienced is a total removal of what I thought of was my family. That's what they tell you. That's what's instilled inside your head. And so I was depressed for years, because I thought that they loved me, and I thought that they were the only ones that cared for me, and they were the ones that knew the truth. There is peer support networks like Curtis Galloway, who's in the chat, who's doing the Conversion Therapy Dropout Network, and there's people like me that are doing CT Survivors, which is ctsurvivors.org, where we have a neuroscientist out of Harvard that is on our team, where we try to have a survivor-based support. We have meditation practices. We do anything that we can to like make sure that we are supported and that we would be able to move in the direction of positive mental health. So it really helps when people know what you have went through when it comes to peer-based support. There's also a little bit of struggles with that too, which makes it hard for the survivor-based because some of those people could also lead conversion therapy. So that's a little bit of a struggle too. So if they go out of that, what is for them? The ex-gay leaders that Dr. Kristopher Wells was talking about, the ex-gay leaders are all some of them don't have a little more than a high school education, but like some of those as ex-gay leaders still need to have emotional and psychological support. So there's like nothing for them. So like, where is the support from you being in this hegemonic structural functionalist system, and how do we as a community have a positive based mental health? And so that's what we need to look at for everybody. It's a challenging task. It's a lot to break down, but that's what we're experiencing, and so we're trying.
How best can allies join and support efforts to end conversion therapy?
Speak out, right? Speak out and denounce it if you see it happen. Support the survivors of conversion therapy, but contact your local elected officials and ask if they have a ban in place. And if they don't, ask them why not? What are they waiting for? If you're interested in knowing the status of conversion therapy laws in Canada, you can go to noconversioncanada.ca, and we have an online map that tracks the state and status of conversion therapy laws in every province and territory in Canada. And so you can go on there and see if your community is listed. And if it's not listed, the first thing I would go and do is call your local city councillor and engage them in the conversation, right? Because this is not only about protecting people from harm and abuse through these bylaws, but these bylaws also, for example, create a very important statement about what your community believes in, right? They signal your values and your beliefs. And it's important also that we're seeing rainbow flags and crosswalks be painted in many communities across Canada, and those are important symbols. But we need more than symbols. We actually need concrete, tangible actions that make a difference in communities. And a conversion therapy bylaw is one way for allies to actually support action on these issues that make a difference to some of the most vulnerable individuals in our community, never mind the important kind of value statement that they create at the same time.
Banning conversion therapy is like the first step. The second step is to make sure that supports are available for survivors. So like I said before, we have a couple of different networks, including Conversion Therapy Dropout Network and ctsurvivors.org, that are wanting to have survivor-based support, but even financial support, just like donating a little bit of money to go to programs that are having neuroscientists, medical professionals, historians that tell you the history of conversion therapy, where it comes from. There's like banning it and putting protections in place for queer, trans, and non-binary folks is the first place. The second place is, what do we do with the people that have experienced it? And this is why financial support is important, because we want to be sure that if something were to happen to a conversion therapy survivor, what do we do? And where do they go? And what is next for them? And who do they talk to? And who do they know? And there's a lot of different things that we just need to do. Banning is only one step. There's a lot more steps that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So BC has claimed that conversion therapy bans are a federal issue since it's for the criminal code. But what can and should lower governments like cities and provinces be doing? This is something you touched on a little bit already, but would love to hear more detail on this.
Yeah, that's a common argument we hear, which is not at all correct. In fact, it's more like passing the buck to a different order of government, absolving yourself of the responsibility to take action and support your local community members. In fact, municipal governments are often considered the government closest to the people, and Vancouver, for example, was the first municipal government in Canada to pass a conversion therapy bylaw by amending an existing business licensing bylaw. So the bylaws have grown much more comprehensive since Vancouver's. In fact, we learn each time a new bylaw is passed about what the various limits of legislation are. So in many municipalities, they don't only deal with business licensing, but the practices, the services, the advertising of businesses. And businesses are defined very broadly, not just something that you pay for a service, but any association, group of people, or a calling. So it can be something, a community gathering, to an organization that's nonprofit, to a business that's selling its services. So at the provincial level, a lot of the legislation we've seen in Canada deals with health, regulating health professions. So rightly so, because that health is in the prerogative of provinces and territories, not the federal government so much like education is, where the criminal code is definitely, in the ambit of the professional government's powers. So we certainly see legislation that prohibits any health professional from engaging in conversion therapy or making referrals to conversion therapy, restricts insured services, billing codes, for example, whether that's public or private insurance. So there are many things that can happen at a provincial level. In fact, I would challenge the BC government to go further and produce the best provincial legislation prohibiting conversion therapy in the country, because there's much that can be learned from the other 3 provinces that have moved forward with provincial legislation thus far, which include Ontario, which was the first, and then Nova Scotia and PEI. And in fact, there's legislation also pending in the Yukon and New Brunswick. In the Yukon, it's very interesting because the legislation was introduced by the sitting government. In New Brunswick, it was introduced by the opposition. So unfortunately, opposition bills often do not go very far within governments. But this is something that every party should get behind. In fact, I think the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada needs to come out and be very clear where he stands on conversion therapy. He's had very mixed messages in the past, certainly saying at one time he was in favor of a ban on conversion therapy, but it would still be acceptable in certain situations, which is not acceptable. There is no situation in which conversion therapy should be allowed, as well as certainly mixed messages from Mr. O'Toole on other issues too. He certainly said he's in favor of same-sex marriage and not going to reopen that. Was in favor of human rights protections for trans Canadians, but abstained from the vote when it did come to time to vote and be counted in Parliament. So these are nonpartisan issues. They should be nonpartisan issues. These should be issues that every political party is supporting, because it's about the health and safety of Canadians.
Human rights, 100% agree. Specifically for BC, I want to know what really is the issue that bills are not being passed, and how come BC, specifically the NDP, is not working with and taking survivor voices, when survivor voices, regardless of me or some other folks, are not being heard. I know that, at least I can only speak for myself. So I know for me, like, there are times that it gets taxing to share your story and to share how it's impacted you. And I had government call me on my phone. Like, I'm not going to say who, BC government, but what I will say is, in private, it's really good that I can get DMs from BC government, but in public, what are you going to do to make equitable change? And even if you did something in your career, what are you doing now? That's all. Like, make some equitable changes for everybody, and it's very easy to do. Work with people that are wanting to make those changes as well.
You know, I would add too, a lot of people are surprised to know that the province of British Columbia is far behind where other parts of Canada are. And when it comes to LGBTQ issues, many have traditionally looked to BC and to Vancouver and Victoria as leaders on these issues, to set an example for others to follow. In this case, certainly the BC government has not shown that leadership, and it's been very surprising. It's been perplexing, and you know, unfortunately, sometimes partisan politics tend to take priority over you know, the realities that people are facing. You know, legislation can always be amended. We shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Moving forward, legislation right now that is good, comprehensive legislation, is a start. It's a commitment, it's a statement. And if that legislation needs to be improved down the road, then let it be improved, right? Amendments can always be introduced. So it's about leadership, and it's about what, as Matt said, what people are willing to fight for.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. So the last question before we switch over to questions from people who are watching, are there any projects or individuals whose work on these issues you're feeling particularly inspired by at the moment?
Who? I would say, so that's a big question for me. And the reason why that it's a big question for me is, so I'll give you a little bit of a story. On the second day I went to conversion therapy, there was a guy named Arthur Goldberg who was sharing this story about the Ferguson versus Jonah case. This is the first case that I think it was the Southern Poverty Law Center sued a conversion therapy camp and won. I met and now am really good friends with Michael Adam Ferguson, who is the neuroscientist out of Harvard. He's also a conversion therapy survivor, and he was the one that sued as an adult. I am very inspired by the work and the tenacity that individual has. He is my best friend, like, very, very knowledgeable, and really wants to do this in a way of humility and not worrying about who gets famous or what. It's just about ending something that was awful to us. And, like, I'm not saying who's looking for what. That's none of my business. But at the end of the day, I want to work with somebody that has honesty and integrity, and I really love him. So I'm inspired by his work.
Yeah, I would say certainly the most inspiring, you know, part of this are the survivors, people like Matt and you know, Peter Gajdich in Vancouver, who wrote you know, the first memoir as a conversion therapy survivor in Canada called The Inheritance of Shame. If you haven't read it, you should definitely pick that up to get that first person understanding. But there are so many survivors that we've met across this country, and each has a different story, but has a common experience in you know, being here today. They're the ones who survived conversion therapy, and have the strength and the courage and the resiliency to be able to speak out. Other organizations that we mentioned, No Conversion Canada has been doing great work just to help to build education and awareness and to amplify the voices of survivors. Certainly the CBRC based in BC has been an important group. That's the Community-Based Research Center. And I know Matt was part of the gathering of survivors that they brought together, and you know, the research that they've been able to support, and again, get the facts and get the evidence out there. And you know, a lot of the laws, prohibition laws that we've seen in Canada have only come about because of the voices of survivors, and the willingness to be able to share their stories, to put their identities out there, to help educate people about the importance of these bans, to make this an issue that people can relate to and can understand. So it's definitely the survivors that are the most important and the most inspiring part of all of this work, and the privilege that you know, those of us in the university or elsewhere, policymakers, have, is simply to help to amplify those voices and help to protect Canadians from these known harms and abuses.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our first question from viewers, this one's from Joyce. Is there a danger of conversion therapy going underground and becoming even more harmful if there's a ban?
Yes. So Zoom calls and Skype counseling sessions that are happening. One of the Skype counseling sessions that I had is by by a guy named Kristopher Doyle. He was my old therapist. If you were to watch the Sunday sessions, it gives you a visual depiction on who Kristopher Doyle is. He does it through Skype, and that goes as far as Brazil, and I did that in the small town of Belleville. Essentially, you can do a Skype call anywhere, and it costs next to nothing, but you still pay $120 a session, hypothetically speaking. So that's just one example. There are other examples that I have heard of that of active conversion therapy groups in Canada that are hosting group conversion therapy sessions, and so that's another way. Just because the pandemic is happening does not mean that conversion therapy is not happening. It's still happening. It's still happening right now. They're advertising it right now. They're calling it something different. They're telling people to go into these group gatherings, and they make it sound pretty and nice, but it's still happening.
Yeah, you know, legislation's never going to be the panacea. It's never going to be the cure-all. It's absolutely important because, again, it's a value statement. And another important role of legislation is it gives somebody who's been victimized by conversion therapy recourse, an ability to report, and to know that, in fact, that this is a crime, that this is inappropriate, this is a violation, and it shouldn't be happening. So I'm not so worried about us pushing it further underground, because it's already underground. In fact, you know, one of the key ways to restrict and hopefully eventually eradicate conversion therapy efforts is by going after the advertising, which Bill C-8 does and bylaws do, because if you can't advertise the services, it gets a lot harder to be able to find them. And we know that still this will happen word of mouth through referrals. But you know, we need to try to take action against what we can control, to send out a strong message, first and foremost, that this is not acceptable. And maybe that will help people question that if they hear about this happening within their own community or through various networks, that they'll intervene, and they'll provide and help direct people to appropriate sources of support, not ones that are harmful and dangerous.
So our next question is from Aaron, who asks, Matt, I see a lot of painful issues of sexuality when it comes to definitions of Black manhood. Do you, as a racial advocate, see more pushback from the Black community towards LGBTQ plus issues?
Loaded question. I see pushback, period. So I I often, what a good question. Okay, so I get excited for questions like this because like I am a visible minority first. I say this on social media. I actually just made a post on this on Instagram. I'm a conversion therapy survivor first. Sorry, I'm a Black man first. I'm a conversion therapy survivor second. And because I see it is because I'm a visual minority in what I see and what I've experienced. A lot of the issues that I see are usually cisgendered white gay men that have experienced conversion therapy. Not my story was different in retrospect of me coming from the stereotypical Christian home. My dad is a Jamaican, specifically a Rastafarian, and I just grew up with a lot of hatred and a lot of homophobia in my household. So I stayed in the closet, and I eventually found conversion therapy in the wormhole of the internet. So as far as as far as that, I get a lot of hate and a lot of depression, specifically from my family. I just got into a fight with a family member of mine just recently, and there's a lot of different layers that are added in to specifically that, and there's not a lot of support as a Black conversion therapy survivor. But yeah, that's a big question. I don't really have like the full answer of that, but what I can tell you is there are, and there's a lot of Black conversion Black people that I know that are in conversion therapy right now that cling on to religion because it is what is near and dear to them, and is what their family wanted, and yet there's just not a lot of support for us. So it's a really big issue. So thanks for that question.
So Sophie asks, how can children from faith-based schools and communities seek support if they are being forced into conversion therapy and have no one to turn to validate their identity?
Yeah, that's a big concern. We know that some Catholic schools, in fact, have often referred to youth who they describe as same-sex attracted. You notice that there's not even often using the language of LGBTQ or refer to a gender ideology as though transgender people don't actually exist. Very concerned about youth in those publicly funded schools. Often a great source of support is our GSAs, and that's why you've seen certainly in Ontario and Alberta such a fight for GSAs and the legislation that's in place to mandate that even in Catholic schools, if youth wants a GSA by law, the school must provide and support them. But unfortunately, again, it comes back to a lack of visibility, a lack of inclusion in curriculum to show that LGBTQ people do exist. And in fact, you shouldn't have to leave your faith in order to accept your sexuality or your gender. But that's a choice that many people feel that they have to make because many of their faith communities are not inclusive. I'll give you an example, a really powerful example that came out of Calgary and their municipal ban. In fact, there were several days of public hearing. In fact, hundreds of people registered to speak, and there were many faith-based individuals and groups that spoke out against the ban. What ended up happening was a letter was submitted from over 20 LGBTQ religious affirming churches and congregations in Calgary, which simply said conversion therapy is not part of our faith, and it's not acceptable. In fact, we welcome and we affirm LGBTQ people in the fullness of God within our religion. A person shouldn't have to change who they are to find support and acceptance. So Issues in Catholic schools are still very challenging. In fact, just look in the news the past couple of days from the Catholic school trustee with the, I believe it was the Toronto District Catholic School Board, who introduced a motion to include pedophilia and bestiality amongst other protected grounds when there was conversation about simply including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and marital status in their policies. So we're still dealing with overt homophobia and LGBTQ discrimination within the Catholic school system within our general society. So it's that trickle-down effect.
Agreed. I have nothing to add.
Okay. And then we have another question from Eric. Why does C8 specify that only gay to straight conversion will be banned? Is there a reason, or is it extraneous and unneeded to the bill?
So hence, that is the reason why that we are, Erica Muse said it beautifully, wrote an article on the CBRC website, I think. It needs to be inclusive for trans and non-binary people too. Like, conversion therapy, in essence, is harmful for everybody. And so we can't just focus on like gay men, because that's just going to defeat the purpose. We need to focus on everybody, because everybody is being harmed by this.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that that comment. That particular phrasing is confusing to many. In fact, if you believe conversion therapy is wrong, is immoral and harmful, it doesn't matter which way the conversion happens, quote unquote. So we often, have this statement to simply that disproves, the efficacy of conversion therapy. Simply show me one person who is straight that's been made gay, right? So what makes you think you can turn a gay person, quote unquote, straight? It doesn't work. So it doesn't matter, quote unquote, the direction of the conversion. None of it is acceptable. And as Matt importantly mentioned, we want to make sure that this legislation is fully inclusive of trans and non-binary Canadians who are also subjected to conversion therapy. In fact, research from the Trans Pulse survey showed that I believe 8% of trans individuals had been exposed to conversion therapy in their survey in Canada, and that number goes even higher for different age groups.
Eric has a follow-up. So he asked, it has I'm not sure if he wants me to read out the stream of numbers, but 302.101A has a gender cutout, which seems to allow gender conversion. I assume that's part of the bill.
So there's often, this has been brought up in various forms of legislation that somehow this conversion therapy prohibition legislation will prevent people from being able to transition. And in fact, that's why you often see some very clear clauses saying that nothing in this legislation should impede a person to be able to find legal, social, or medical support for their transition processes. So I think legislation wants to be very clear that this is not about preventing people from being able to access gender affirmative care and support.
Okay, so our next question is, why aren't educators and politicians required to undergo education and training on LGBTQ+ sensitivity? And when they are, how can we handle people in positions of authority who reject such training? This question is from Ronnie.
That's a tough question. I think regionalization in regions, in certain regions are easier than others. I mean, I go to school at the University of Toronto, and it's a very inclusive and accepting school, but it's also region, like Sam Brinton, who is the vice president of government affairs at the Trevor Project, said this beautifully. Whether you're in New York City or you're in a small town in Kansas, everybody should be treated with dignity and respect. Very bad paraphrasing, but at the end of the day, like all I think is we should just listen and learn to people, because language is always improving, and people are changing, and it's a different time. Like, for example, like uh we wouldn't say 20 years ago that we knew what texting was. Nobody knew what texting was 20 years ago, for example, because in year 2000 they didn't really have cell phones, I don't think. But just to give you an idea, it's just a little example, but all we have to do is just treat people with dignity and respect.
Yeah, I would add, I think, that's a great comment. This training is important. We talk about it as core competencies that people, particularly in professions such as medical doctor or healthcare or education or social work, that they have the core competencies or the skills to adequately, treat particularly vulnerable or marginalized populations. And that's not in place, right? Nobody should be graduating from particularly the helping and supportive professions without these competencies, because we see that the effects of that in education when people try to, from the LGBT community, go in to a doctor's office for care, often face discrimination or re-victimization because of homophobia or transphobia or biphobia. So I think what we need to do is hold our universities, our programs accountable to ensure that these are not options. There are many optional LGBT courses now students can take, but there are a few core ones that are required upon graduation. I'll give you a similar kind of example around Indigenous education. So, for example, in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta, it's a core requirement that every undergraduate pre-service teacher has to take an Indigenous education course, 3 credits to graduate, right? That's a core competency, and many universities are doing that, not only in education, but for all undergraduates must take at least one course in Indigenous issues, because this is how we're going to start to begin to address issues like racism, like homophobia, to talk about colonization, to change some of these attitudes. Education is key. So it's about professional competencies, and if you're out there, well, then the licensing bodies should also require these competencies as well, to be able to be certified. That's really the way that we're going to see the change happen, because right now it's optional. So it's often said that you're going to get those early adopters, or it's like preaching to the choir, right? You're going to get the people who support this, they want to learn more about it, but how do we get the people in the middle, which was where most of the people are, and then how do we get the other people who are the resistors, to this as well. So, if we keep coming back to, for me, it's about education, education, education. How do we mandate this for professionals? And how do we get education not only in our universities and colleges, but out there in communities as well?
Is there anything that we haven't discussed today yet that you think is important to mention in this discussion? Any final notes from either of you?
If something is worth fighting for, you're going to do it. And if people are worth fighting for, then you're going to do it for people.
I would just reemphasize that, conversion therapy is nothing more than a dangerous lie. It's deceptive and harmful practice. We need to show leadership and put an end to it in Canada. I think all of us can go out and advocate to our various levels of governments and all of our elected officials, even at the school board level, asking, does your school board have a sexual orientation and gender identity policy? Does it include a prohibition on conversion therapy and, you know, educators or school staff making referrals to conversion therapy? I know the BCTF has had a long-standing policy for the British Columbia Teachers Federation. It's been an example for many others, right? We often signal our values through the kinds of policies and legislation that we enact. And so, you know, if we want to see this change, we need to support the politicians to go out and make the change. There is overwhelming research and science to support the evidence of why this is important to take action. We've heard from the voices of survivors, the firsthand lived experience about why this is important. So if not, why not? I think we need to hold our elected officials accountable and show them that this is an important issue that they must take action on. And again, there are good resources out there if people want to educate themselves on conversion therapy, about its history and its background and the research. Again, you can go to the No Conversion Canada website, great resources from the CBRC. So there's no shortage of information to take action that's available out there, and good Canadian information and research that is now out there thanks to people like Dr. Travis Salloway at Simon Fraser University and others.
Yeah, and ask us if you can either reach out to us on social medias, at Kristopher Wells, for example, Dr. Kristopher Wells Twitter, or at Matt Ash89. There's always questions that you can ask us. Follow us, get connected. We don't want to have the conversation just to stop here. This movement is bigger than Chris and I. This movement is for people, and it's for the future generations, and it's to make equitable changes for people that deserve it. We deserve it. The queer community deserves it. Non-binary, transgender, two-spirited people all deserve it. We want to have equitable change, and equitable changes starts when conversion therapy ends.
And you know, and as Matt says, no one's asking for special rights, just human rights, basic human rights. The opportunity to be safe and valued and cared for in your community in this great country of Canada that we're all so proud to be members of. We know we've got a lot of work to do to ensure equality, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for our Indigenous and our racialized communities and many other communities as well. And that won't happen without all of us advocating for it to happen. So I know that your organization, the BC Humanists Association, has a petition that can be signed to support the federal government to not forget about Bill C-8, right? To hold their toes to the fire. They made a commitment to us, and it's in those mandate letters of 2 ministers. So they need to deliver on this commitment, and to remember that this shouldn't be a partisan issue. This shouldn't be an issue that pits religion against the LGBT community. That happens far too often, but there are many faith communities that openly support, embrace, and affirm LGBTQ people and don't try to change them. Go out and find your local affirming congregation and work with them and support them because they're doing incredibly important work. Change as often happens at the grassroots level.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight and for giving so much of your time to speak on an important topic. And yeah, thank you for all the work that you do as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. And I forgot to mention one thing. If you want more information too on conversion therapy in Canada, W5 did a documentary earlier this year that Matt and I both had the privilege of being a part of. But it really goes underground on what's happening with conversion therapy in Canada. It could have been a full hour. There was enough content, but it's a short and perhaps eye-opening primer on the state of conversion therapy in Canada, and it really speaks to why it's important for governments to be able to take action on this.
CTVW5, Thy Will Be Done. It is probably one of my favorite interviews that I have done. Yeah, it's great. I would highly recommend that you watch it.
It's very cool. Is it available online?
Yes, it is.
Could you maybe pop a link in the
here's the YouTube link. Thank you so much, Joyce. It's a really good interview, and it really gives you a tangible experience on what I went through, what another survivor, Harper, what they've been through. These are tangible examples, and we're real people that have been through real stuff when it comes to conversion therapy. And now that things are being vocalized in the forefront, there's no hiding anymore. So it's either you're for the side that is going to bring equitable changes to make history happen in an exponential way that is going to be a benefit to humanity, or you're going to stay in the past. Regardless of what's going to happen, we hope to have those changes for us because we deserve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much again for your time today. And thank you everyone who joined us. As Chris mentioned, we do have a petition you can sign in the chat. And also remember to call your MPs because that is also very important. But yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your days, everybody. And thanks for making this panel really great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.